Let's be clear from the outset. What happened to Charlie Kirk was murder. It was a tragedy. A young man, just 31 years old, gunned down in front of his own children, his own wife. Charlie Kirk, 31 years old, was one of the most visible voices of the contemporary conservative movement. He was shot dead while speaking at a university event, in plain sight, in a public square in Utah, under a white gazebo before thousands. A question posed. A second later, a single shot from above. Shock, panic, chaos. The suspect, now in custody, allegedly scarred by political rage, full of hate, family said. The bullet casings engraved with slogans, "Hey fascist, catch." A moment meant for public discourse turned into violence. The irony is, the very question posed to Kirk at the time of the shooting was one about gun violence. A collision, political speech, ideology, identity, and now death. But let's be clear about who Charlie Kirk was and what he represented. He was not an inspirational leader. He was a political extremist, an agitator who built an empire out of division. He profited from fear, not hope. His ministry was not one of service. It was a cancer aimed at killing the American Republic, one falsehood, one wedge issue, one toxic broadcast at a time. He represented the MAGA flag, not the American flag. In a nation already fractured, this incident pulls us deeper. How did we arrive at a moment in which political violence isn't an abstract but bleeds in broad daylight? How have the stories we tell ourselves about conservatism, ideology, morality, identity shaped not only policy, but the atmosphere in which men like Charlie Kirk rise and fall? Today, we turn to Professor Allan Lichtman's Conservative at the Core, a new history of American conservatism. Professor Lichtman is no stranger to predicting the trajectory of American politics. His 13 Keys to the White House model has nearly perfected the art of forecasting the presidency. But now he takes on something even more foundational: what conservatism is, what it claims to be, and what it has been in practice, and what it is becoming. In this sweeping history, Professor Lichtman argues that many of the values Americans associate with conservatism, free enterprise, limited fiscal responsibility, are often more about branding than about consistent practice. At its core, he claims, conservatism in America has always revolved around two pillars: traditional Christian values and the defense of private, not free enterprise. And he warns that Donald Trump is not the departure from tradition, he is the logical culmination. As the nation looks and reflects and debates about the legacy of Charlie Kirk, we also ask, how does the conservative movement that Kirk embodied, or argued he embodied, connect with these deep undercurrents Professor Lichtman dissects? Professor Lichtman, thank you for being back on the Political Mic.
My great pleasure, Mike. Good to talk to you.
Professor Lichtman, it's been a while since we've spoken, but I want to start off the discussion by asking you to give your take, your thoughts about the tragedy that unfolded this past Wednesday at Utah.
Yeah, I think some very important distinctions need to be made. One, we can certainly mourn a tragedy. We can certainly mourn a life cut down tragically much too soon. I have a live show every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern with my son at Allan Lichtman YouTube, and I made that point on my show last night. But that does not mean that we have to celebrate the life of Charlie Kirk. And that's a critically important distinction. As you say, his is not a life we should celebrate. It is a life filled with demeaning people, dehumanizing people, not bringing us together, but promoting divisions. It is a life marked by racism and misogyny. As you say, just before his death, he was asked about an absurd question: how many mass shootings? And by the way, there are over 300 of them already. The same day that Charlie Kirk was shot down, there was a mass shooting at a high school in Colorado. And nobody noticed it because mass shootings have become so routine. So he was asked about an absurd question: how many mass shooters are transgender? His answer was, too many. This is a guy who called Martin Luther King awful, a bad person, who opposed the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, perhaps the most important legislation since World War II that finally ended segregation and Jim Crow. He opposed it. You know, they always have excuses because it had something to do with affirmative action and bureaucracy, which it had nothing to do with. He said roving Black people are roving around trying to commit crimes against white people. You know, he talked about a black pilot, and oh my God, that's got to be someone who's affirmative action, not qualified, and made all kinds of statements like that. He talked about Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift and said, Taylor Swift, forget feminism, just obey your husband. That is, women should go back to the 19th century when they're just subordinate to their husbands. And she said, he said, you got to change your name or it's not real. You got to become Taylor Kelce. He endorsed the notorious great replacement theory, the idea, that foreigners, un-Americans are replacing, as he said, white rural Americans. This is the tip of the iceberg off the top of my head of the kind of hateful, misogynist, racist, divisive elements that he so clearly represented. So I mourn his death, but I don't celebrate his life. The other thing that appalled me is this tragedy should have been an opportunity to bring us together in opposition, not just to political violence, but to gun violence generally. 15,000 gun murders every year. You as an American are 20 times, not 20%, 20 times more likely to be murdered by a gun than a resident of our closest peer democracies per capita, the G7 nations plus Australia. As I said, more than one mass shootings every single day in America. This could have been a teaching moment. This could have been a time to try to dampen down the division and polarization that leads to this kind of violence. Instead, his allies have done just the opposite, used this tragedy to inflame divisions, not to dampen violence, but to promote violence. Look at the reports in the press. Look at what Republican members of Congress, Republican influencers have said. This is blood on the hands of Democrats before they even knew who the shooter was and anything about him. This is 100% on Democrats. Time and time again, they've said, we're going to hunt down the Democrats. They're a terrorist organization. At least 3 or 4 major Republican influencers and one member of Congress has said this is war. Can you imagine? They're declaring war as a result of this, just doing the opposite of what we ought to do. And this brings me to tear. I mourn both the death of Charlie Kirk, who I have to say I did not know personally, and the horrific response of his conservative and Republican supporters.
And what's interesting is that the death of Charlie Kirk, the murder, does not take place in a vacuum. We've seen a rise in political violence. So you go back a few weeks to June, you had the death of Speaker Emerita Melissa Hortman of the Minnesota House of Representatives.
And her husband.
Right, and her husband. They were attacked in their own home. You go back a little bit further, you go into October of 2022, and you have the attack of Nancy Pelosi's husband in his own home with a hammer. You see before January 6th, there was an attempt to capture Gretchen Whitmer, kidnap her at the state capitol in Michigan. Then, of course, we have January the 6th. And so Charlie Kirk's, this incident, this tragedy that took place with Charlie Kirk does not occur in a silo. It's a part of a longer narrative. And what's interesting, I'm glad you brought it out, is that the right-wing media, Fox News particularly, has gone out of their way to blame the left when there was not even a person in custody yet. And my question was, why didn't they go to Twitter and at FBI, they notify the FBI that they had apparently knew something that the rest of us didn't know, the identity of the assassin. But they didn't know the identity of the assassin, but they were quick to blame this and frame this as a politically motivated event when we did not know the motivation. We did not know the identity of the killer. The killer was just recently announced today to be a 22-year-old Tyler Robinson.
After all of these inflammatory statements were made, after.
Right.
I can't stress that too much. They were operating on just made up stuff. There was nothing real, since we didn't even know who the shooter was.
And to me, the media has not denounced that loud enough. Responsible legacy.
I'm disgusted with a lot of the media. This is a five-alarm fire, what's going on in this country. Now, look, I'm not comparing Trump to Hitler or his minions to Hitler's supporters at all. But I do want to put some historical perspective on this. This is very close to what we saw right after Hitler took power in Germany, the famous Reichstag fire, the fire in the German parliament. And nobody really knew, just back then or even today, who was actually responsible for setting the fire. It may have been his left-wing opponents. It may have been the Nazis themselves, to create an excuse. And even though we had no idea who really was behind it, they used this as an excuse to go after their political enemies and to establish, which had not been established yet, tight authoritarian control over the German government. The Hitler dictatorship was a direct result of the exploitation of the fire in the parliament. Again, I'm not claiming anyone here is a Hitler, but I am putting some historical perspective because they are using this event the same way Hitler and his followers used the fire in parliament. I can't hear you.
I just wanted to just go back to the media a little bit. Have you noticed that in this era, since Donald Trump has risen in prominence in the political arena, that the media has done so much bending over backwards to appease conservatives? We've seen the removal of certain figures for very, minuscule offenses. I mean, you look at ABC News and how they capitulated with the lawsuit instead of actually force Donald Trump to prove malice in court. You look at the fact that they dismiss one of their respected reporters for simply saying that Stephen Miller was a man full of hate. Now, correct me if I'm wrong.
Look what happens to the two of our premier newspapers, Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post, taken over by billionaires appeasing Trump.
And to me, if Edward R. Murrow or Walter Cronkite had actually made that statement, America would look at it as a moment of journalism and journalistic integrity, actually challenging folks based on their record and their actions about where they stand morally. All he said was based on his position on separating children purposefully as a deterrent, that he was a man full of hate, and that was enough to allow him to lose his job. The reporter I'm talking about, of course, is forgive me. I have the name at the tip of my tongue. ABC News reporter. The name will come back to me.
Sure, I'm sure.
But
yeah.
but the point still stands that you have a situation where the media, it seems, is bending over backwards. You see the dismissal of Joy Reid from MSNBC, Mehdi Hassan. You see the elevation of certain voices like Scott Jennings, who lies regularly on the CNN roundtable with Abby Phillips and gets no repercussions or anything like that. I was watching This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and I'm noticing Donna Brazile fade into the wall in the background, and it turns into a debate between Chris Christie and Reince Priebus. And I'm wondering, why am I watching two Republicans? I'm grateful that Chris Christie can see clearly, that this MAGA stuff is not normal. But I'm still wondering, where is the media to check, these hard-right Republicans, even if it leads them to look like they're supporting Democrats? The truth is the truth, no matter where it leads you.
Right. This both-sidism is a lot of nonsense. As you say, the truth is not just a mushy in-between middle. I've been a professor for 52 years. I've devoted myself to finding the truth. And one of the things that has disturbed me most is the way in which Donald Trump and his allies have utterly destroyed truth. My brilliant wife, Karen Strickler, a great political organizer, said it goes beyond that. They've destroyed reality. We've now entered the world of doublethink of 1984, where war is peace, famine is plenty, hate is love. It's even hard to get a handle on reality. So this both sides is a pile of nonsense. We don't look for both sides. We look for the truth. At least that's what we're supposed to be doing. And two problems with the media. One, it's become so corporate. It's either owned by billionaires or owned by these big corporations who have an interest in appeasing Donald Trump. They have all kinds of business conflicts with the administration. That is an enormous problem. The other problem is Trump is great for ratings. When Trump is sort of out of the picture, all of the ratings, all of the viewerships fall. And, that's critical. I wonder if we can turn to my book now, because I think it gives a lot of insight into this.
Yes, and I want to turn to their book because in chapter 1, you draw a line between dispensable versus core conservative values. Could you walk us through your method?
Yes.
What's your test for deciding what belongs to conservatism's core and what's just outer rhetoric?
This is a brand new approach to conservatism. I think for way too long, not just commentators, not just journalists, but even serious scholars have been misled by taking at face value what conservatives profess they stand for. I have been informed in my analysis, I don't think any historian has done this before, by the great late epistemologist Imre Lakatos, who talked about both scientific programs and political programs. And he said, in each case, you have this immutable core of values that doesn't change. And it is surrounded by an outer belt of dispensable ideas, discardable ideas, simply designed to protect the core. And what I have found using that framework is virtually everything that conservatives profess to stand for is part of that discardable outer belt and not an immutable core value. For example, free enterprise. Conservatives, starting with the tariffs of the 1920s, and I've looked at the last 100 years to support this, going through favorable legislation, special tax breaks, loans, subsidies, anti-labor legislation, have destroyed the concept of free markets and free enterprise. Fiscal responsibility, conservatives have blown the biggest holes in our deficit. Trump, W. Bush, H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan. States' rights, they look what Donald Trump just said. The states are just agents of the federal government, and they've got to do whatever I tell them, including overriding their laws. But go back to prohibition right after World War I, which overrode the laws of every state that had some access to alcohol. Look at Republicans trying to pass a right to life amendment, which would override the abortion laws of every state. Limited government, forget it. Prohibition again. The war on drugs, going back to the 20s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, huge intrusions of government. And what are the biggest intrusions today? The anti-abortion laws in so many states, which puts government into our bedrooms, and this huge buildup of ICE, which has big government intruding on our communities, our workplaces, our churches, our schools. We haven't seen anything like this with respect to big government. Law and order, need I say anything about the Republican Party being led by a 34 convicted felon, or the many Republican scandals going back to Teapot Dome in the 1920s, Watergate under Nixon, Iran-Contra under Reagan. I could go on, but the point is none of these ideas are actually followed, and both scholars and journalists don't understand it. So what do they really stand for? What has been consistent over 100 years of conservative history? Two things: support, as you say, for private, not free enterprise. That is, support for business, just the opposite of populism. This misnomer of Trump as a populist is ridiculous. And throughout their history, they have firmly supported business through protective tariffs, loans, subsidies, foreign policies to keep markets and raw materials open to them, anti-labor laws. None of this has anything to do with free markets. It has everything to do with upholding business. The second thing that they stand for is their own narrow, self-serving version of what they claim to be traditional Christian values. Mike Johnson said, pick up a Bible and you can understand my policies. No, they have focused in a self-serving way on fringe elements of Christian teaching that barely register, things like gender identity, deviant sexuality, abortion, and ignored the vast bulk of Christian teachings, which has to do with the dangers of greed and wealth. It was Jesus who said, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to go to heaven. They have ignored critical teachings on fidelity to truth, on caring for the poor, the vulnerable, and the sojourner. So when you cut through this outer belt of discardable ideas, you uncover what conservatism is really all about. And from that perspective, with his cultural wars, with his tax cuts, deregulations, Donald Trump is not, as you say, the betrayer of conservatism, but the culmination of 100 years of American conservatism.
And what a lot of people will be surprised to learn is that the war on drugs, like you alluded to briefly, did not begin in the 1970s under Nixon, but under Warren G. Harding in the 1920s. Could you shed some light about that? Because that to me was surprising to learn.
Yeah, it was around the late teens, the 1920s, under the head of the National Anti-Drug Organization that began crusading against drugs and shifting from what had been the previous approach, which was the curative approach, try to deal with the problem of drugs by medical, psychological interventions, not law enforcement. And that led to then the first anti-drug laws, the marijuana tax law, and then other prohibitions on drugs that long predate Nixon and Reagan.
And when you say conservative values, how has Christian nationalism shaped conservative policy and rhetoric from the 20th century into the Trump era today?
It fundamentally shapes conservative ideology because, as we saw with Mike Johnson, who thinks he's got a pipeline to the almighty, what is critical about the right for 100 years, the rise of the evangelicals and they're becoming part of conservatism did not start with Jerry Falwell and the moral majority in the late 1970s. It goes all the way back to the 1920s and 1930s. In fact, the first Christian right organization was not the moral majority in the late 70s. It was spiritual mobilization in the early 1930s. So this idea that we have divine sanction for our policies is critical. And the logical corollary of that is that if we are blessed by God and what we're doing has divine sanctions, then what you're doing in opposition to us is damned. It's evil. It goes against the divinity. You're challenging not just us, but you're challenging God. And that is, of course, the Christian nationalist position. And so it logically follows what conservatism has represented for the last 100 years. It's also tied to white nationalism. I just read an extraordinary statement by Senator Schmidt, a staunch conservative at a recent conservative gathering, in which he said, and obviously he wouldn't be saying this if he didn't think it resonated with fellow conservatives, that America is not based on the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, equal opportunity. Not at all. It's based on race. That is, the real America is the European white Christian settlers who, in their view, conquered an untamed wilderness and brought the blessings of white Christian civilization across the continent. And everyone else is an intruder, whether it's Native Americans who were there for thousands of years earlier, unwanted immigrants, Jews, Black people, Hispanics, doesn't matter. If you're not part of the descendants of this pioneer generation, you're not a real American. And think of the horrors that follow from that. Yeah. It's this us versus them. It's always an us and it's always a them. At one time, believe it or not, the them was the French and the French Canadians. Then it was the Germans, the Irish, the Jews, the Mexicans, the Muslims. Throughout American history, it's been, people of color. There's always this us versus them. And for the right, as I explain in my book, they give it divine sanction.
And what's interesting is that the hypocrisy is so blatant that because anytime you bring up slavery, anytime you bring up reparations, anytime you bring up systemic racism in America, what the conservatives tell you is that you're stuck on the past. Meanwhile, they're simultaneously looking to do away with defund programs like PBS, ban books, rewrite history. They are systematically looking to undo the gains made, not just from the civil rights era, but any gains made from Reconstruction. And I alluded to it earlier, Charlie Kirk, before he was assassinated, was seeking to dismantle the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was their goal. You've already seen the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, 2013, Shelby versus Holder. We've seen, the rejection of the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill. We've seen state after state. Donald Trump shifted his focus to Texas. After 2 weeks, the Democrats caved in and went back to Austin, to the Capitol. And then after the maps changed, Trump shifted his focus to Mississippi, where they're looking to make the exact same thing. You have a George W. Bush era judge in a 108-page opinion actually criticizing the newly drawn Mississippi maps that are blatantly racist, that blatantly undermine the voting power of Blacks and Latinos, and are designed to maximize the white voting power. How do you handle the voices of dissenting Christians, Black churches?
Very, very difficult. Yeah.
Catholics?
George Orwell said, and he was right, who controls the past controls the present, and who controls the present controls the past. And that's really prescient. In other words, these arguments about our heritage are not irrelevant. As you point out, they shape our view today. Look at, and I commend you to look at this, the 1776 report, which was Donald Trump at the end of his first term, his official report outlining American history and the American experience. It virtually scrubs, wipes out any kind of, as you say, history of racism, discrimination, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny. It's not even in there, and it completely distorts the historical record. Why? Because if America was basically, as Trump just said a couple of weeks ago, and again in his executive order on what's going on in the Smithsonian, is just this triumphant march towards freedom and human happiness, then we don't have to worry about structural racism. We can abolish civil rights protections. We can redistrict in a way that disenfranchise American minorities. We could gut the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, because we know all of that's irrelevant. America is just a triumphant march to a perfect meritocracy where everyone has an equal chance to succeed or not on their own merits, and there's no such thing as lingering or structural discrimination. It all ties together, and it's all in my book.
And in your book, you also talk about free enterprise in chapter 3. How does your account challenge the simplistic left-wing stereotypes about who regulates and who deregulates?
Exactly. What I show is that even scholars are deceived in believing that conservatives stand for free enterprise or free markets. That's one of their most vociferously presented ideas. And it couldn't be more false. What conservatives have represented is the political arm of American business. And we can see that going all the way back, as you say, to the Harding administration. What did he do? He adopted protective tariffs for favored businesses, repealing the tariff reforms of his predecessor, Woodrow Wilson. He drastically cut taxes on behalf of business and the wealthy. He deregulated so business would have no restraints. He made pro-business appointments to critical regulatory agencies. He suspended antitrust laws to allow multinational corporations to operate more freely. And it's exactly the same thing Donald Trump is doing, 100 years later. It has nothing to do with free markets. It's the opposite of free markets. And in the States, of course, conservative governments have given special tax breaks to business, subsidies to business, loans to business to attract them to their states. Again, that has nothing to do with the free market and free enterprise. And of course, we know from Taft-Hartley on the way in which conservatives have intervened to destroy fair bargaining between business and workers. Again, nothing to do with free enterprise and everything to do with promoting private enterprise. It's one of the most critical distinctions we can make. And sadly, it's been missed, not just by journalists, but unfortunately by scholars as well.
And how has law and order evolved in conservative rhetoric from the early uses through Nixon, Reagan, Bush, and now Trump? You see the deployment of National Guard troops in American cities. We saw them in Los Angeles. You see them in Washington, D.C. This is page 555, the bottom paragraph of Project 2025. And now an announcement that Donald Trump is now shifting focus to not Chicago anymore, but to Memphis, Tennessee. Let's face it, Republican states lead the nation in gun deaths and crime. And so it was apparent that this was not really about crime, but this was about, exercising flexing authoritarian muscle. How does law and order evolve in conservative rhetoric? And how does your book get into that?
Once again, scholars have made the mistake of dating it, to Richard Nixon's law and order campaign in 1968. Untrue. It goes back to 1919 and to Calvin Coolidge, governor of Massachusetts, breaking the police strike on the grounds that I am advancing and promoting law and order. And he became known as the law and order executive. And when he ran for vice president with Warren Harding, one of the themes was law and order. And in the 20s, you see, as early as that, conservatives saying we're upholding the rule of law, as opposed to those lawless Democrats who, for example, are subverting the enforcement of our prohibition laws because they don't really believe in law and order. So this goes, like almost everything else, back to the post-World War I era. And of course, in actual practice, as I point out in my book, conservatives have been the opposite of law and order, starting with the Teapot Dome scandals. Some of the worst scandals in American history of basically conservatives in the government selling, their power for bribes. It was the first time a cabinet member, Albert Fall, Secretary of the Interior, was convicted of bribery and sent to jail. A complete violation, of course, in law and order. And remember, in those days, conservatism was not confined to the Republican Party. A big locus of conservatism, as you know, Mike, was white supremacist Democrats in the South. And what was going on in the South in the late 19th and early 20th century? Lynching. And
Exactly.
what were these law enforcement, law and order conservatives doing about it? Nothing. Turning a blind eye or being complicit. That was also the time when we got the incredible Tulsa massacre of 1921, which wiped out the greatest concentration of Black wealth, not on Wall Street in New York, but on the Tulsa Black Wall Street. And again, this was a conservative city for whites, and the police were complicit. And then you could take this all the way up through Richard Nixon's lawlessness and, dozens of convictions in the Watergate scandal, the Iran-Contra scandal, when under Reagan they were trying to run a government within a government. And of course, I need not go through all of the ways in which Donald Trump and his allies have flouted and violated law and order.
Yeah.
What they view as law and order, as you point out, is basically crackdowns on what they consider quote unquote dangerous people, most notably people of color in our big cities.
And it's amazing because a lot of people, particularly young people on the internet, would say the party switch is a myth. The fact that the party switched ideologies, switched approaches to civil rights, switched approaches to how it deals with minorities. Oh, that's a myth. But when you go back to 1964 and the Republican National Convention, when Barry Goldwater is nominated, there is chaos. The convention floor erupts into hostility, not just towards liberal delegates like New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who was drowned out by boos, but also toward the few Black participants brave enough to attend. Belva Davis, who was a Black journalist covering the event, found herself targeted with slurs, threats, physical danger. Garbage and glass bottles rained down as she and her colleague fled. Jackie Robinson was attending as a delegate, and he faced similar hostility. He compared that atmosphere to Hitler's Germany. And so conveniently, that's forgotten as we're talking about the history of the Republican Party. That's forgotten. And people say, well, this not the Republicans freed the slaves. The Republicans were the party that got you the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, completely overlooking this
huge switch,
transformation, right?
Which they transformed. I've written about that a lot, and all of the major civil rights initiatives were pushed forward by Democratic, not Republican presidents. And it was Republican appointees on the court, as you point out, who gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013 by abolishing Section 5(3) clearance in effect, and who have very sharply narrowed the scope of the Voting Rights Act. Of course, as you point out, it was the conservative darling, the late Charlie Kirk, who thought that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a mistake. And its, major proponent, Martin Luther King, was an awful person. And of course, we now see under Donald Trump the dismantling of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice and the complete, disingenuous turnaround to the idea that it's really white people in America who are being discriminated against. I guarantee you the average Black person and the average white person would not, the average Black person would not, white person would not want to change places, because the average white income, education, wealth is still enormously above that of the average Black person. We still have, as you point out, structural racism, lingering effects of discrimination, documented time and time again. And, I've studied this in the States, where they've attacked this idea of structural racism. And you know where it came from? This attack on so-called critical race theory, not from any scholars, but from a Republican operative, Christopher Rufo, who said this would be a great wedge issue to use against the Democrats. Exactly. And they have no scholarship behind it, as compared to the overwhelming bulk of scholarship the other way. When Trump issued his 1776 report, virtually every scholarly and academic organization in America, about 50 of them, join with the American Historical Association to denounce this approach to history, this sanitizing away of any discrimination or racism. Said, this isn't history. This is politically driven falsehood that bears no relationship to the last 40 years of historical scholarship.
And what's interesting is that the Republicans in the 20th century, they were more open to actually providing means for African Americans to succeed in America. You go back to Nixon, he had Arthur Fletcher, who was a Labor Department official. And the Nixon administrations started to look at affirmative action and adopt it as a federal mandate for companies with federal contracts and for labor unions to hire more blacks. They had a commission to create more black millionaires. And then you transition to Reagan, and it's a complete 180. What happened?
I point out in my book that Richard Nixon was the most liberal American president, leaving aside all of his violations of law and order, his paranoia, his twisted, just looking at his policies, the most liberal president between Lyndon Johnson and Barack Obama. I got to go pretty soon, so I would again remind people, it's all there in my book, Conservative at the Core, A New History of American Conservatism.
Well, Professor Lichtman, thank you so much for the time. Your work reminds us that conservatism isn't just a set of passing slogans or campaign tricks. It's a living tradition with deep roots, contradictions, and consequences for the country we live in. So the book, again, is named Conservatism at the Core, and it forces us to ask hard questions about what is essential and what is expendable, not just for conservatives, but for American democracy itself. Thank you so much for dedicating time to come on the political mic, Professor Lichtman.
Take care, Mike. Let's do it again. You know where to find me. Bye-bye.
All right, take care.
Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mike podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePollyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.